Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, a name that would become synonymous with horror. But he began life like any other child, born in Milwaukee in 1960. His was a seemingly ordinary family. His father, a chemist, his mother, a homemaker. Yet, even in the serenity of Midwestern life, darkness was brewing. Dahmer's childhood held glimpses of the monster he would become. A fascination with bones, sparked by a childhood fascination with animal anatomy. A growing detachment from the world and those around him. An unsettling silence that hid a storm of dark thoughts within. The monster, however, was not yet fully formed. It needed a trigger, a catalyst that would shatter the fragile facade of normalcy. That catalyst would come in the summer of 1978, marking a terrifying turning point from which there would be no return. Dahmer's teenage years were marked by isolation. He was withdrawn, an outsider amongst his peers. His interest in the macabre deepened. He became fixated on death, collecting animal carcasses and dissecting them in the woods behind his house. He found a perverse pleasure in these acts, the blood, the smell of decay, the feeling of control over something lifeless. This morbid curiosity, once a whisper, was becoming a roar within him, threatening to consume him entirely. His parents' divorce only exacerbated his solitude. He retreated further into himself, finding solace in his dark fantasies. He began to fantasize about controlling not just the dead, but the living as well. These fantasies, fueled by his isolation and fascination with death, were growing more vivid, more sinister. June 18, 1978, a humid summer day in Ohio. Dahmer, fresh out of high school, was alone. His parents were gone, his dark fantasies swirling in his mind. He picked up a hitchhiker, 18-year-old Stephen Hicks. It was a decision that would seal his fate and unleash a monster. He invited Hicks back to his house. They drank beer, talked. But the monster inside Dahmer had awakened. He bludgeoned Hicks with a dumbbell, a brutal act that silenced the young man forever. The world didn't yet know it, but a serial killer was born. Dahmer dismembered Hicks's body, scattering the remains in the woods. The act, far from repulsing him, brought a twisted sense of satisfaction. He had crossed a line, stepped into a realm of unimaginable darkness, and he felt no remorse, only a chilling sense of power. The 1980s were a blur of fleeting encounters and escalating depravity for Dahmer. He moved to an apartment in Milwaukee, a nondescript building that would become a gruesome stage for his darkest desires. The stench of death clung to the air, a horrifying testament to his crimes. He lured young men to his apartment, often promising them money or a place to stay. Once inside, he would drug them, rendering them helpless. Then, the torture would begin. His apartment, once ordinary, transformed into a house of horrors. His crimes grew increasingly horrific. He experimented with his victims, attempting to create his own twisted versions of living dolls. He photographed their bodies in various stages of dismemberment, preserving the horror of his acts like trophies. He was no longer content with simply taking lives. He sought to control them even in death. Dahmer's reign of terror continued for over a decade. He moved from apartment to apartment, always seeking new victims. The people around him, oblivious to the monster in their midst, dismissed the signs. The stench was blamed on plumbing issues, the late-night noises on drunken arguments. Milwaukee, unknowingly, lived under a spell of fear. Young men, mostly from marginalized communities, disappeared without a trace. Their families, desperate for answers, were met with indifference and inaction from authorities. The city, it seemed, had turned a blind eye to the horror unfolding within its borders. Dahmer, emboldened by his ability to evade capture, grew more brazen. He kept souvenirs of his victims, skulls, bones, even preserved body parts. His apartment became a macabre museum of his own making, each gruesome artifact a chilling reminder of his depravity. July 22, 1991. Tracy Edwards, a young man who had narrowly escaped Dahmer's clutches, stumbled into the night, his wrists still shackled. He flagged down a police car, his story so unbelievable, so horrifying, that the officers initially doubted him. Edwards led the officers back to Dahmer's apartment, apartment 213, a place that would forever be etched in the annals of criminal history. The officers entered, their nostrils assaulted by the putrid stench of decay. What they discovered inside was beyond their worst nightmares. Polaroid pictures of dismembered bodies lay scattered on the counter. A human head sat in the refrigerator. The air was thick with the smell of rotting flesh. The officers, hardened by years on the force, were visibly shaken. They had stumbled upon a charnel house, a scene of unimaginable horror. The scene was like a living nightmare. Horrifying pictures, the stifling stench of death, and inside the refrigerator, a human head. There was no doubt. They had entered the home of a serial killer, the home of Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer surrendered without a fight, as if he knew his time was up. At the police station, Dahmer began to talk. With chilling calmness and no remorse, he revealed everything. He confessed to murdering 17 young men, detailing how he lured them, drugged them, and then dismembered them. But it wasn't just about killing. He admitted to insane experiments, attempting to turn his victims into zombies, drilling holes in their skulls, injecting acid, and even eating parts of his victims. The world was in shock. News of his crimes spread like wildfire. Newspapers, TV channels, everyone was talking about the Milwaukee Monster. His defense team tried to prove he was insane, but the jury wasn't convinced. He was sentenced to 957 years behind bars, a fate he couldn't escape. But justice wasn't done yet. Just 2 years later, on November 28, 1994, he was brutally beaten to death in prison by another inmate. And in the end, Dahmer fell, a victim of the same brutality he had inflicted on others. Jeffrey Dahmer's story ended, but the horror he created will never be forgotten.